Well, everyone has their various views on the afterlife, and with this, it's interesting, of course, to get into the thinking of St. Paul, because, of course, he talked of such things. And various people, you would say, have different views and different hopes and different ideas and even different realities about the afterlife, let's say. Well, Paul had some interesting experiences in his life in that he actually went to what he called the third heaven. The conclusion with that is that he somehow or other went on some kind of spiritual trip, let's say, though it didn't follow that he necessarily left his body, as in his spirit came out of his body and then went to this other place, which he chose to call the third heaven. Now, whether he left his body or not, he couldn't explain it. He said whether in the body or out of body, he couldn't explain how this happened. All he knew was it happened. And so he said, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot say. But alas, he did go to this place which he called the third heaven. So there's one view, you might say, of this other place in the afterlife, this other realm, whatever you wish to call it. And you think, well, I guess the first heaven is the atmospheric heavens up there. You can see the sky, the sun, and all this. The second heaven would be like the stars, the planets, and space. And the third heaven would be going into the other realm, which some people call heaven. And the original word for heaven actually was the heavens out there, being the atmospheric heavens, being the sky, the air, the big blue sky up there, the sun, the moon, the stars. This was the original word used in the Bible for heaven. So God, in the beginning, created the heaven and the earth. But when you're talking about the third heaven, you're going beyond the sky, beyond the stars, let's say, space, and then into that other realm, which St. Paul chose to call the third heaven. And there he heard things that he found hard to explain. So with a lot of people who have these visitations into the, let's say, the spiritual realm, the spiritual world, the spiritual realities, you can't always explain what happened exactly, only that you had perhaps a peep into such places. And whether you heard a voice or not isn't always the case, though people usually come up with the phrase, oh, he's a person who hears voices. It doesn't always follow that they hear anything audible in their ears, but they do get the message as to what they in that other place, in that other realm, would be saying to you. So a kind of a form of telepathy taking place there with people who have visitations to this other realm. You get the message, but you didn't hear a word, though you knew exactly what you were being told, is often the case, though no audible words heard. Why not speak with telepathy? Then you get exactly what's in a person's mind. Of course, we use words, but words often fail us. We always hear this when someone's trying to describe something that's beyond words. It's beyond words, which is how I feel. Often used in a negative sense. Someone's gone through an awful experience, and therefore they say words fail me. And so people might harp upon certain things in order to get out exactly how they're feeling and the ongoing feeling of hurt or even joy that they're feeling. And so words can be quite repetitive in that we often use words in a repetitive manner to explain or to express exactly how we feel. And on here, of course, you have people going on a rant and all of this to express their anger, but there in the other realm you can just simply communicate, and they not download, but they simply relate to you exactly what they're seeing and feeling. And so Paul appears to have had such a similar experience in that he couldn't completely explain it. All he knew was it happened, and he done his best to explain it in saying he went to the third heaven. Well, of course, there are other views that St. Paul had. Well, we often find ourselves talking about St. Paul, for instance, because he pretty much wrote most of the New Testament. And of course, the Gospels have the account and the life story of Jesus and the disciples and what took place for all of the events and the words of Jesus. But I guess St. Paul was the one who kind of opened up exactly why and what Jesus came for. And so he harped on a lot about grace and works, which to most people would probably mean nothing. What's grace and what's works? In other words, he felt that as a human being, he said, let's say a lot of what Paul said was of course written hundreds of years ago. and so of course the style of speaking and the language and the fact that it uses yea and ye and thou is Old English, of course. And the Bible was written 2,000 years ago and so on, and translated by the King James version, which I choose to read, which is the most original words of Jesus, the most original words of Paul. And so Paul come up with phrases, they're written in verse format and all this, which can sound very religious, but in simply to quote what he said, the good that I would, I do not. He felt that this was his natural state, his normal human condition. The good that I would, I do not. But the evil which I would not, that I do. So no matter how much he tried to do good, in other words, and a lot of people can relate to this, they might set out to do good, to do the right thing, but they often find themselves doing the wrong thing, or even worse, they become worse than what they set out to be or what they were before. So St. Paul coined this phrase, as I remember it, I'm relying upon memory here, and I don't know always exactly where this is going to go. One thing can lead to another, and you might find yourself talking about something else other than you set out to talk about. But God willing, this is about the afterlife and different people's views on this. And of course, the most reliable view is to go with the one who said it first and the one who has had experiences of the same and is a reliable source. This might mean going way back in time to the scriptures. And the scriptures, of course, were written in what people might call a fuddy-duddy language or whatever, written by people that are a lot older than younger, and therefore speaking more maturely and speaking soberly, because it's a sobering matter. And a lot of people don't want to sober up, and they might appear too sober. But it is a very colourful book when you open these verses up, when you read it in the Spirit, and God willing talk about these things in the Spirit. Well, what is the Spirit? You simply ask Jesus into your heart in acknowledgement, let's say, of what Paul was getting at in his various writings. He saying, for the good that I would, he wants to be good, right? For the good that I would, I do not. But the evil which I would not, that I do. So he ends up, he wants to do good, but he can't seem to find it in himself to do good. So he needs help to do good. He acknowledges this. For to will is present with me. So he's got the will, he wants to. But how to perform that which is good, I find not. It's not in him to do the right thing, though he might even have, you're born with certain nature, you're born prone to certain sins, let's say, one person is prone to this kind of sin, another is prone to that kind of sin or sins, and one might have one nature, another might have another nature, and so on. So we pretty much arrive at the conclusion of who we are by the time we get to at least 18. And it appears really that from 18 onwards or thereabouts, when you're a teenager, you're pretty much grown up and you have an idea, or you certainly get to know who you are and what you're capable of. And so then you find yourself having to grapple with sin or not, doing the right thing or not, whether you call what you're doing right or wrong as sin and God and the devil and all this. But it's a case of you pretty much know who you are by then, or you've got a damn good idea. And therefore, you know what you want out of life and what your philosophy is on life and all this. So Paul obviously arriving at these conclusions: for the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. So of course he saw the need there for a saviour, and so he chose to ask Jesus into his heart. And then he found from then onwards that he could do the good that he would, and so on. The very opposite: for the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. So by grace, so in other words, gift received at Christ's expense, another GRACE, for by grace are ye saved. Saved from what? Largely saved from ourselves, because we're such a hell of a mess. And so often it's the case: for the good that I would, I do not. We might set out to do good and do the right thing, but damn it, we always fall into the same pitfalls, or even others. Instead of becoming better than we were, we often become worse. And thus we see the story of man. And all of these good intentions down through the ages is just like sewing new cloth onto an old garment. And really, these so-called new ideas and good ideas end up renting the cloth, renting away, tearing. If you've ever sewn a new patch onto an old worn-out garment, you put it through the wash, and before you know it, the new patch is torn away from the old garment and made the old garment worse. So all of these kind of so-called new good ideas down through the ages has simply made things worse. And of course, we now have a world that's being transformed with new good ideas, so-called good ideas coming in. And again, it's going to rent away from the garment and make the garment worse. To the garment is just unwearable, and nothing left to do but to throw that garment away. It's not even good for charity, to give to charity, or even recycle. Just burn the damn thing up. It's useless. It's hopeless. It's good for nothing. So Paul obviously felt the need to ask Jesus into his life, into his heart, and to cover his sins, and then find it within himself to do good. So by grace, he said, are ye saved, and that not of yourselves. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. So for the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. So yeah, we've all heard of the 10 Commandments, but can we keep them? They just make us worse sinners, because now we know the 10 Commandments. Now we know what we should do. We know what's right and wrong by God, and if we don't do what's right, having known what's right, we go ahead and do what's wrong, then this makes us a sinner. So you might want to plug your ears up and not hear what God has to say, but somewhere or other down the line, whether it's in a film or somewhere, or you're going to hear, or everyone's heard of the 10 Commandments: thou shalt not kill, and all this: thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not commit adultery, and bear false witness, and all these things. But now we know we shouldn't do it. We go ahead and do it. This then makes us a sinner. So this is the 10 Commandments, the law. But when we try to do the right thing in our own strength, Without God's help, without Jesus in our heart, without love in our heart, without the one in our heart who loves everybody, then we find we fall short. So for by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. So you might try to work hard at all of this in order to boast, but finally you'll find yourself failing yet again. So again, all really on the subject of the afterlife, in that someone who chooses to believe there is an afterlife suddenly realizes, well, the goal of life doesn't follow that it's altogether this life. You also have to consider the afterlife and the next life. So here's St. Paul in one of his writings, we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and he's largely again talking about, let's say, his body and the afterlife. For we know, so we're in chapter 5, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. For we know that if our earthly house, now Jesus called this body his temple, where we dwell, in other words, you're a spirit in a body, simple as that. And but here's Paul, he's calling this body an earthly house of this tabernacle. A tabernacle really is a tent. So here we are, you're a spirit in a body. God actually is the Father of spirits, and your spirit has been placed in a body, which Jesus called a temple. And here's Paul calling it an earthly house of this tabernacle. So a tent. So here you are, we've all been in a tent, you're a spirit, you're in a body, and Paul is simply calling this body a tent. A tabernacle, in other words, is a tent. So for we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle, this tent, were dissolved, in other words, died, one day this body's going to die, we have a building of God, and house not made with hands. So in other words, we're going, Paul largely here talking about the resurrection. So hence you get another view of the afterlife, and the other life being also the case that you're going to need a body for all eternity. This body, of course, is going to die, dissolve, as he says, for we know that our earthly house of this tabernacle, this tent, were dissolved, died, in other words. We have a building of God. In other words, he's talking about the new body that he's going to receive from God. Now, everyone and everything has a body. St. Paul talks about this kind of thing in another chapter where he talks about bodies. So everything has a body. A bird is a body, a worm, an animal. It's the amount, when you add this all up, the amount of bodies that God has created, each one of us need a body. We being a spirit in a body, 7 billion people on this earth, and each person is a spirit in a body. We've been placed here in a body. And thousands, millions of birds, millions of fish, they all have bodies. And millions of animals all have bodies. So God is in the business, of course, of creating bodies. Various bodies. A fish has one body, his body lives under the sea. A worm lives under the dirt, so that's his abode, that's his habitation, that's where he dwells. A worm dwells under the earth, so he needs a different sort of body. A fish lives under the water, so he needs a different body. And all of these various creatures have these various different bodies. And of course we have a human body, so we're a human in a body. But this human body and pretty much everything that comes into this world comes in via the seed. In our body, we have a seed. In other words, we reproduce. We we have sex, and therefore we have children. And this is what God said to every creature on earth that he created: be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. So everything here is interesting, because everything here has its seed in itself and will reproduce, recreate. But of course, everything here in this life will die. So God appears to have made everything in this world. Every body in this world will eventually die, whether you're animal, fish, or human. But that which is seen is temporary. In other words, it will one day die. That which is seen is temporary, but that which is not seen is eternal. So we presently in this temporary body which reproduces and eventually dies, and so life goes on. But the thing is here, what about when you die? Then you're going to wonder about the next life. Is this it? Is this all there is? So hence you have St. Paul largely talking about the resurrection, and his hope for the afterlife, the next life, is largely talking about the resurrection. Jesus came, died, rose again, and presented himself as being alive, though once dead, not seeing corruption. His body didn't go into total decay and corruption, in other words, but suddenly he's alive again and appears to his disciples and starts talking along the lines of they of course were scared when they saw him suddenly appearing in the room, because they all knew he'd been crucified 3 days earlier, and suddenly they see Jesus appearing in the room. And automatically, if that suddenly happened, you might not think you would, but of course you would be afraid, even though it's Jesus. Even though it was Jesus and they knew him all too well, they were of course afraid. And I guess you picture them moving back and shocked by all of this. But Jesus saying, touch me. A spirit, he's not a ghost, in other words, he's saying a spirit have not flesh and bones. He didn't say flesh and blood. He said a spirit have not flesh and bones. So you picture them moving forward, of course, touching Jesus, and yes, indeed, he's alive, and it's Jesus, and somehow or other he's solid and he has flesh and bones. Well, St. Paul also said flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Now, we know that the life of our flesh here is in our blood, and without the blood, take away the blood, the 8 pints of blood, then we die. And we eat, and of course everything, the body is nourished by the blood. So life here is dependent upon the blood. The life of the flesh, the life of every creature really is in the blood. But in the afterlife, Jesus saying flesh and bones, not flesh and blood. But now he appears to have, or he does indeed have a body, and he doesn't refer to himself as being flesh and blood. He refers to himself as being flesh and bones. So this is largely the kind of thinking the Bible has, talking about the other life. And it appears from the we were born here, God breathed into Adam's nostrils a breath of life. And this breath of life coming from God being our spirit. And so man became a living soul, becoming both body and spirit. And therefore we're given a short lifespan here. 70 is the general lifespan underlined by the Bible that most people do live. And of course it goes on to say, but if you by some good chance and good health go to live longer, then God willing, this is so, and so people do. But of course, time goes by, and you get over your 30 or 40-year bracket, and if you're lucky, you have no health issues. Well, Paul appears to be over into that age, and of course, the weight of his body is no doubt a burden to him. In fact, he was losing his sight, and I guess he wasn't always in the best of health, as is often the case with when you get over certain ages, and the worst case scenario is some illness might develop and you're stuck with it until the day you finally perish, wither away and die. And of course, with this kind of thinking, you think, wow, I can see how Paul felt burdened down by his body when he wrote these words here.